is simply the notion that the disciples imagined all of this, that they hallucinated it in some way. I mean, you could understand why somebody might believe this to be the case, right? Because even if it's just it's not so much deceptive, it's not so much ill motivated. This is just the natural inclination of people who really wanted Jesus to be alive. There's a sense that this was like shocking and saddening, and people were desperate and grieving afterwards. And if that's the case, their grief might have led them to see something and then imagine something that isn't true. Now, I get you. These are some pretty large, extended hallucinations, but this idea that they would have hallucinated this, I think, comes primarily from the notion that these folks were in grief. And a lot of the earliest appearances of Jesus appear to be kind of like one-on-ones. So, for example, if you were in the garden, the tomb garden, and you see Jesus, I mean, you don't think that Mary desperately wanted Jesus to be alive? Then she sees someone who's just the gardener, but she thinks, oh, it's Jesus. And, she mistake. No, it is not Jesus, Mary. It's just the gardener. You just desperately want it to be Jesus, and you are by yourself. So your desire is what's corrupting your view of the gardener and turning him into Jesus. You could at least understand why somebody might argue this. You've got a single person seeing Jesus at one point, and it just wants it to be true so desperately that she imagines it to be true. You could even make this kind of argument here, one person. You could even make this kind of argument, say with Peter, who, at least in a couple of accounts here, appears to be having single interactions with Jesus. Well, look, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. You don't think he felt bad about that? You don't think he wishes he could have gone back and rewound the clock? And then he starts to imagine things because in his grief, he is by himself, just like Mary was. And so you have this single view of Jesus. 2 now who, in their grief, have imagined seeing Jesus. Even have one account that appears, at least from one passage in 1 Corinthians, that did he appear to James by himself? If so, James is somebody who didn't treat him all that well, his own brother. You don't think he felt bad about that and wished that Jesus was still alive? This might explain why, by himself, he has a single vision of Jesus. But then it gets weird, because there is another person who was by himself when he saw Jesus, and that is the disciple, the apostle Paul, who was at this time known as Saul of Tarsus. But I don't think that Paul, who was Saul at the time, wanted Jesus to be alive. It's not like his grief is driving him to see something that doesn't actually exist. I don't think that Saul is looking for Jesus at all in this way. Yet, here he is by himself. This is where it gets a little weird, right? Because you might argue this for Peter and James and Mary, but you really can't argue that approach for Saul. Saul does not want Jesus to be alive. And then it gets even weirder, because you have more than one person seeing and claiming to see the same thing, like the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Now think about that for a second. If I told you that I had a dream last night and you were able to recall all of the distinct attributes of my dream, that would freak me out, right? Because we don't have group dreams. You shouldn't know the details of my dreams. That's where it gets weird. And if 2 people end up saying, yeah, I saw it too, how do you explain this? Even these 2 appear to be wishing that Jesus was alive. But how do you explain the group hallucination? There are no accurate, long-term, involved, elaborate group hallucinations. There just aren't. And now you can argue that some people will say they saw the same thing, but when it gets down to drills down to the details, they're widely divergent because they are hallucinating. But here you have people who are going to write down these accounts, and they're all going to agree on these accounts. And they're very different. The accounts are very different. We'll be talking about that in a future message on this. But here, for example, now you have three who are seeing the same thing at the same time. That's weird. Here you have 7, the 7 disciples who were at the sea. And if you look at that, I couldn't even get them all on the same slide here for you. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll give you 5. There's 2 over here off the image. Okay. So you have 7 people who are reporting the exact same encounter. That's very different than saying that one person wants it so bad that he's imagining it. And then you have, all the disciples minus Judas, minus Thomas. So there are 10 here who, at least in these episodes of the Gospels, are reporting these having seen the same thing. And there's 10. That's kind of hard to explain. Even when Thomas comes back in, now you've got at least 1 or more accounts in which you've got at least the 11 And then, of course, you got the disciples with Thomas, that's 11. And then you got the disciples in other places in scripture where I'm not quite sure how many are going to be here. At the mountain, for example, this is just the 12 minus 1. Is it every disciple that was part of the larger group that he would teach? It's not always clear in some of these how many people are involved, but there's at least 11. And I'm only going to count 11 here. This is one of my favorite of all of the episodes in scripture. Look, the ascension of Jesus, how many people are standing there watching it? It's kind of hard to say from scripture to be sure, but there are going to be at least the 11, probably more. And if you just took out the resurrection, if there was no resurrection of Jesus, if Jesus wasn't executed on a cross, just lived into his 30s and decides one day to demonstrate his deity by ascending into heaven, don't you think that that event itself would be noteworthy enough to demonstrate to the disciples that Jesus is something other than human? I think so. I think this would be, of course, it's very different than defeating death. But my point is, this would be pretty miraculous. As a matter of fact, I suspect some people we talk about this with, if they could just see this happen in front of their own eyes, it would be at least a demonstration they would have to consider seriously. Well, I'm going to show it to you right now. So here we go. Let's have Jesus ascend right in front of your eyes. There he goes. Well, how many people saw that? At least 11. And I think that most people who would see the ascension would be convinced on that alone that something different's happening here. And then, of course, we have other accounts in the Gospels. We have one in 1 Corinthians where we have I couldn't even number all of these. I could try. I'm going to go ahead and make an attempt here to number and order all of these. But this is a large number of people who saw the same thing on the same day. I'll have to add a few more here on either side. This is really hard to explain by way of group hallucination. And by the way, if you were having doubts about this, if you thought, are we just imagining this? Well, what's the one thing you could do? You could just run to the tomb, because there should be a body in the tomb if you're just imagining that he rose from the grave. But the tomb is empty, which means that now someone's either stole the body out of the tomb. Do you see how a lot of these kind of roll downhill to some form of conspiracy theory? Because at some point, someone's got to get the body out of the tomb so that your hallucination seems to be more substantive and more substantiated. So I think in the end, this is why someone like Peter will say in scripture, hey, we're not making this stuff up. It's just not some cleverly invented story. This is what we saw with our own eyes. We were the eyewitnesses of all this stuff. So when it comes down to delusions or to hallucination theories, yeah, is it possible? I always say yes. Anything is possible, but I'm not after possible. I'm after reasonable. Let me go one more step with you. Is it possible that these folks were fooled by an impostor? Because that's another possibility, right? This is often said that this is not a delusion or maybe a hallucination, but it's somebody who carefully looks slightly different because he isn't Jesus and he's fooling you. Do you know who this guy is? This guy is somebody you probably should know. This is a guy who was a con man. And we have a lot of folks on our team working homicides who came to us out of fraud and forgery, different section of our detective division. And these folks get to deal with people who are conning. Con men are called con men for a reason. This is Charles Ponzi. And Ponzi is the guy who's responsible for what we now call Ponzi schemes. Well, it turns out con men are called con men because they have attributes that make it possible for them to fool others. And their attributes are pretty cool. They have the confidence of the people they are trying to fool. That's why they're called con men. They're confidence men. They have the confidence. They have the trust. And they have to know more about the thing they're lying about than the people they're lying to. They have to know more about the thing they're lying about than the people they're lying to. If you know something about business, you'll spot quickly that his business deals, Ponzi's business deals, are a sham. But if he can speak more and know more than you know, he can fool you if he has your trust. Well, that means if somebody is conning the disciples into believing that Jesus is alive, he would have to be somebody who knew as much about Jesus as they did, to repeat his words, to recall events they experienced together. That means we're looking for somebody from the inner circle, and he's going to have help because he's got to get that tomb empty. And the problem I have with all of these kind of schemes is that the person who is post-resurrection, whoever that con man is, he has to be really good at what he does, because it turns out all of the accounts in the resurrection involve the same type of supernatural activity that we see with Jesus He can do things that only Jesus can do. He can appear miraculously, for example, in a way that only God could do, right? I mean, how do you pull that off? How do you perform the same kinds of miracles that Jesus could perform before the resurrection? How do you even ascend? You see, there's a supernatural aspect of the con man that doesn't make any sense if he's just a guy pretending to be Jesus. In other words, the Jesus after the resurrection can do all the Jesus stuff that the Jesus before the resurrection could do. And that's why this is, to me, not an adequate explanation. Yes, it's possible that someone could be posing as Jesus, but if that's the case, I don't know how you would explain all of the ability this person has, right? And he has to be somebody who's from the inner circle. And in the end, it's going to involve probably more than one person to pull off all these tricks and to pull off and this is why you already know why I reject this as a conspiracy, but this is the problem I have with the entire imposter theory, which is not a popular theory, but it is offered sometimes, I think, because people know the other theories don't work. And there we are again with another theory that's usually developed, I think, to respond to the weakness that are posed by the alternative theories from a secular perspective. So, but again, I've had conversations with people. This is not unusual because so many people within Islam would argue that Jesus did not actually die and resurrect on the cross, that was an imposter on one side or the other of the cross. So there's the problem with it, right? In the end, we have to ask the questions. There's something supernatural, the same testimony from the same eyewitnesses who saw the other miracles of Jesus have to be weighed the same way you weigh their claims about the resurrection. And that's the problem I have. You've got these claims. If it's a lie, it's not just the resurrection that's a lie. Every miracle is also a lie. If this is an elaborate con game, or if this is an elaborate conspiracy, everything about the Jesus story is part of the lie. And that's why I reject it. Too many